Hello everyone and welcome to Overexposed, a BWRM podcast where we delve into the ins and outs of running a real estate photography and videography business. My name's Dave Temple.
And my name is Jackie Kirk. Our guest today has a diverse background in military, government, corporate and small business. He's worked with the RAAF, the Defence Force, Austal and the ACCC, to name a few. I suspect he may be a former spy, but I'm told that he can neither confirm nor deny that. To most of you listening, however, you'll know him as Richard Mendelsohn, someone who's been instrumental in helping to define what BWRM is and where we're going. He's a mentor, he's a coach with a special talent for understanding people and what drives them. Working with individual businesses, he helps our members define where they want to go and helps to put together a plan to get them there. Richard, thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to have you here.
Great to be here with both of you.
So, Richard, before we get into what you're doing now and how you're involved with BWRM, can you take me back to the start? You began your career with the RAAF as a cryptology technical specialist. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
It sounds cool. What if as a cryptology technical specialist with the Air Force?
It was an unusual thing because I came straight from high school and went into the military. And it was not my intention to get into that field at all. I actually wanted to join aircrew, and that's why I knocked on the door of the RAAF. But you go through 3 days of assessing, and I failed the eye test on day one. and they asked me, the old test where they say, "Can you read the bottom line?" No. Next, no. Next, no. Next, E. And they said, "You know what? That's not good. That's not good enough." But they kept on testing me, and they then reported back and said, "Look, you can't get into aircrew, but you can get into anything else that we have to offer." And being young, not knowing anything about what to expect or what to do, I said, okay. Look, is there any sort of trade or mustering that pays more than any other?" And they said, electronics and radar. I said, okay, yeah, right. So within electronics and radar, is there anything that sort of pays more than the other areas? And they said, it's telecommunications, ground radar, avionics, that area. I said, okay. So out of those three, does one pay more than the other? And they said, well, telecommunication does. Okay, right. Within telecommunications, is there anything that pays more than the other? I said, well, there's this obscure area called cryptology. I said, is there anything within cryptology? And they said, no, that's it. That's the highest paid. I said, okay, I'll do that one. So that's how I ended up doing cryptology. And so I started off a bit like Guy, actually. I started off my career as a tradie.
Tradie sort of code breaker. I wish I'd had that sort of smart attitude at 21. I instead decided to do graphic design, which probably pays a fraction of it. So that's really interesting, Richard. So what exactly is cryptology?
It comes under the category of secure communications. And what you do now, where everything is encrypted on your phone, or if you go into certain sites and you might be having secure communications between yourself and others, that's really what cryptology was all about. It was making sure that when the military sends its messages, that it's coded and only the right people who it's destined for can access that. And then the other part of cryptology is if you're good at that, can you actually then access other communication and break that down, right? So it's something every country does, so we're not unique in that space.
So reading other countries' mail, I think you've told me.
Yeah, that's right. Reading your neighbour's mail, that's a little bit like what that's all about. And
wow.
But within the military, it's very much around point-to-point communication, making sure that it's secure and that people can't really intercept it and then read what you're talking about.
That is fascinating. So where did you go from there? You're obviously not doing that anymore.
Well, so I did my 6 years with the Air Force, and I would have stayed in there for my full time, but I was married at the time, and wives don't really like the military because you're often away and you don't tell them where you are, and then you sort of show up one day and you sort of stay at home for a bit longer, then you go away again. So the time came, and I had to leave in a certain way because I wanted to as well, I suppose. Bit of pressure, but I went from there into a couple of companies that were into a new field of mini computers and things like that. So my technical background actually helped me get into some other jobs, but I didn't really enjoy that too much. And then at some point, Defence Signals Directorate, they contacted me, and they're an intelligence organisation within the Department of Defence, and said, look, we're looking for system controllers to run some state-of-the-art equipment. You've had some good training in the Air Force. Have you thought about considering joining us? And I think the first thing I said was, how did you get my number? I had not left my number with anyone. But anyway, I spoke to them, and they came up with some really interesting job offers, and I decided to join them, which I then really enjoyed. But I think if I think about what set me up on that pathway is when you go into the military, and that for some people that can be a good thing. It certainly was for me. And being exposed to discipline, structure, learning was a great way to enter the workforce.
Where did you go from there, Richard?
Well, after my 13 or so years working as a person with defence in uniform and then later as a civilian, I had finished my degree at Monash Uni, and an opportunity came up to join this new organisation called the Australian Telecommunications Authority. And they were looking for people who were open to working in an industry that was opening up to competition. I don't know if you remember, but it's when we broke up the Telstra monopoly and introduced competition to the telecommunications world. So that was in the early 90s. And that was a fascinating organisation to work with, because there were a lot of young people that came in there. We had very diverse backgrounds. I had qualifications in the technical side, but then finished my business degree. But I was working there with arts degree students, lawyers who didn't want to be lawyers, but had done their training and finished that off, engineers. And it was, and they were all young, and it was a fantastic place to work. And it's probably the job I enjoyed most where I was working for someone. It was a fascinating area, and it was just all new.
And was it just that it was new, or what was it that made you love that job, Richard? Was it that it was new? Was it the culture? What made you love it so much?
Well, it was all of that. I think it was a great culture because it was partly because no one really knew what they were doing. So you had to help each other and collaborate a lot. And everything that came at you was new and different. And, for example, when I came in there, I was told, okay, you're going to do this project. You're going to come up with a class licensing system for international telecommunication services. Now, I couldn't even understand what that meant. But they said, okay, well, off you go and just work on that. So you have to tap into other people. And it was actually really refreshing because people would say, oh, that sounds really interesting, Richard. I've also got a really new and different project I'm working on. Maybe we can work together and see what we come up with. And it was very much like that. And it's the culture that generates, new people who want to work collectively, collaboratively, and focus on outcomes that were beneficial to everyone, is just a fabulous place to work in, right? And not everyone has the opportunity to be exposed to that.
I imagine that's a huge cultural shift between the sort of structured, almost regimented or actually regimented, approach of military. It's done this way because it's done this way and you have to do it this way, to sort of, it seems like a taste of freedom, really.
Yeah, so it was in a sense, David. It's a good question, right? Because the military and where I was before, it was a structured organisation and everything inside it was structured. When I went to the Australian Telecommunications Authority, it's still a public service entity, but so it's structured on the outside, but it's very organic within the organisation, if you know what I mean. So there was a lot of freedom there to do things and explore things and work together on outcomes, but there's still a structure around it to make sure that You delivered it a particular way. You still had to deliver your recommendations to a board. You still had to work within a structured project management approach. But in terms of the ability to look for results and outcomes, that gave you a lot more freedom than the military probably would. Okay, so it was quite a different work environment for me, and I absolutely loved it. And you're right, Dave, I think it was probably the ability to step outside was with what you had to normally do that made it so interesting, and everybody was really enjoying that.
So was the company doing anything specifically to encourage that? Was it a very deliberate cultural thing, or was it just the nature of the work and the nature of the people?
Well, it was a bit of both. So the nature of the work was very interesting anyway, because it was the first, I think Australia was the third country in the world to open up the telecommunications market. So there wasn't a lot of experience around. So we had to generate new ideas and innovate and come up with new ways of doing things. So that's good. But the general manager that I had was also a very young person. And I think all of us in the management team at the Australian Telecommunications were sort of between late 20s and mid-30s. So it was a very young group of people working on these very complex issues. And he was a great guy. He was really good at picking out people that could work together and could work collaboratively. And his focus was about creating high-performing cultures and picking people that fit his team. And that's probably the first time I was exposed to that sort of working. And he was great at that. And I was quite envious about it because I've never been really good at that sort of thing, picking the right people because they can actually contribute something to the benefit of the larger team. I think that's quite a skill set and you've got to be good at it. And he really picked some fantastic people to work with.
So I'm going to fast forward a little bit then from there, because we'll get back to that, because that's something you do very well now, is focusing on creating high-performing teams. But how did you get to that point? So you're working with Austel. You ended up overseas for a bit as well, but somehow You've made your way to what you're doing now, which is coaching and mentoring and getting to what you're doing with us. How did that happen?
Okay, well, after Austel, I moved to the ACCC, which actually is a little bit more like the military. It's very structured, and it's a very structured approach to doing things. So I probably didn't enjoy that structure again, but it was a very interesting organisation to work with. It's got an incredible reputation within industry. So I enjoyed my time there. But it was probably my time at the ACCC which gave me the opportunity to then move overseas and move out of the public service into the corporate world. And I joined an organisation called KPN, which was the Dutch equivalent of Telstra. And the interesting thing about Europe was they were watching what the US, the UK and Australia were doing with deregulating their telecommunications market. So they came to Australia to learn and ask questions about how did you guys do that? And so I ended up talking to a bunch of Dutch executives who came to the ACCC and were asking for an information session and learn about how we had done things. And I just happened to say to one of them, you guys setting up a regulatory authority up there, would they be interested in people with my background? And they said, well, I don't know if they are, but we are. Mm-hmm. So the next thing you know, I had a job offer to go to The Hague and work at head office there. And I set up their regulatory affairs department. It was the first one that they had. And so it was actually a lot of change in a very short period of time. So I moved from the public service into the corporate sector. Then I moved from Australia to a new country, and I worked from a totally new culture of doing things to a culture which, first you think, well, it's a Western culture, so it's the same. And Dutch work culture is actually very different to Australian work culture. And I had to sort of adjust myself to all of that. I think the real reason I went to the Netherlands, though, was because I still have a lot of family in Holland, and we immigrated from there many years ago. and it was an opportunity for me to actually work there and reconnect with my family. So that was the thing. But of course, work became a very important part of that thing, and I had an interesting job. So when I was in The Hague, I set up the Regulatory Affairs Department, and then they moved me to Brussels, and they said, look, we need someone there to interact and interface with the EU institutions. So I effectively became a lobbyist and moved to Brussels and worked very closely with the parliamentarians over there, the EU parliamentarians, and with all the institutions that make up the EU. So once again, a great opportunity to do something very different that I was very unfamiliar with, but a great learning experience. And cultural issues were probably one of the things that I really learned a lot about, and had to sort of get my head around to see if you want to perform well, you have to really understand the culture, and you've got to be part of it, and you've got to fit right and well into that.
And how did you go about that, Richard? Because we've spoken in the past, and if for those of you listening, if you listen to Bob's podcast a few episodes back, we speak about the different personality types, and you've got your expressives like Bob, but Richard, you're obviously an analytical personality, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, traditionally regimented and quite stuck in their ways. I hope you don't take offense to that, but you're working with all these.
Remember, there's two of us here.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, I can talk both of you into submission, so it's fine. You're an analytical personality type traditionally, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is not as flexible with working with other cultures and teams. So how did you go about doing that? Was it very challenging, or did you kind of approach it from an analytical perspective and analyze those teams? How did you, from going from military to corporate to a whole different country with a whole different culture and working culture, you must have just, I don't know, my brain would have exploded.
Yeah, so I really struggled with that. But I guess I listened to your podcast, Jackie, and you actually moved from one country to another as well. So you've got some idea what that is like. But I think for me, the issue was I was moving to a different country, which I thought was a Western country where I went to school and did my primary school years in. So I thought I was very familiar with it. And in Australia, I always lived with this idea that I was a Dutch immigrant living in Australia. So when I went back to the Netherlands, I couldn't understand why I just didn't fit in there. I was really struggling with this whole thing of fitting in to the work culture, and then even with society generally. I guess the good thing that came out of that was that because my formative years were in Australia, I was actually an Australian. I was not actually a Dutch immigrant living in Australia. So I think that was a good thing that came out of it. But going back to your question, yes, I did struggle throughout that whole period. It was very, very difficult to try to adapt more than anything. And, like if you look at the Anglo-Saxon way of working, it's quite hierarchical in some ways, particularly if you come from the background that I had. And the Dutch don't work like that. It's all around working collectively and collaboratively. They have these, what I thought were endless meetings, and you cover a lot of ground, but then all of a sudden a decision is made, and I don't know whenever that happened, and then the whole thing moves on, right? So that was just a totally different way of working, and the reason for that was that everybody must have an opportunity to be heard. Everybody wanted to be heard, but for some reason they know when enough is enough, and then they go and get the job done. And I just never learned where that point was.
I guess what it says to me, though, is hearing that and having done a Vision to Work program with you, which we'll discuss in a little bit, and watching your work with our members is you've got this combination of this person who is very analytical and therefore a very good listener and very good at just hearing and understanding what drives and motivates people, but then also able to adapt to, we speak all the time about the range of personalities and motivators within all of our members. And you have this very unique strength of being able to really focus on and figure out what drives them and help them get to where they want to go instead of where you think they should go or we think they should go. And it's kind of a coaching that you don't realize you're being coached and you don't realize you're changing, and then all of a sudden you're kind of where you need to be, and it's thanks to you. So it sounds like all of those things that you've learned from all these different companies have then helped create that.
Yeah, you're probably right. And I guess that I started off from a highly structured, disciplined, this is how you do it approach. And I ended up in an environment where I felt like an outsider often and wasn't really quite sure how things worked. And it's interesting that when I went to Brussels, you have to do a lot of collaboration with other companies. And the companies I worked best with were the UK ones because I could actually understand them a lot better than others. And that is not to say that these other companies don't know what they're doing. It was just me. I really struggled with the way that they work, and I've been told that the Scandinavians also have this very collaborative approach where, everybody has to be heard and you make collective decisions and then you move on and everything then happens. But if you haven't grown up with that sort of, in that environment, it's very, very challenging. But what it did teach me was that there are so many different things that you need to consider if you want to be a high-performing organization, a high-performing team, and a high-performing individual. And everyone can do that a different way, but you could all end up in the same place, which is a highly successful organization. So you can't just adopt a cookie-cutter approach to many things. It's far more around what does your environment look like and how do you then work with that to get the best results for yourself, for your team, and the organization as a whole.
And that's what you're doing now, isn't it, Richard? So can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing today with that background in mind, or what your current role is?
Okay, I just wanted to tell you something about when I was doing my degree in business, because I was a very analytical person. The topics I did really well in were actually the marketing topics around market research and all those sorts of things, which sort of fitted my background. And the worst two areas that I struggled with were Trade Practices Act, competition law, and the other one was organizational behavior, because they just made no sense to me whatsoever. And I just find it remarkable that they are the two areas I ended up in.
Yeah.
Right? So I could have done market research. I could have done research analytical type work, but I end up going into two areas that I probably didn't understand when I was doing my degree.
But perhaps you went into them to sort them out because you didn't understand them. Perhaps there's a bit of that.
Yeah, well, maybe, but it's just interesting how you sort of land in all these situations that are so different and so uncomfortable for me. And that ended up being my career. And so while I was quite on and off, black or white initially, I started becoming more and more open to different things. And I think it's that journey that I went on working for these very large organizations and being exposed to so many different factors in those organizations that made me decide, well, what do I want to do when I go back? So after my 5 or 6 years in Europe, I think I spent 6 winters there. I decided, okay, well, that's it. I'm going back home. And I came back to Australia. And for about 12 months, I took time out just to think, okay, what am I going to do next in my career? And there were a couple of things that I really wanted to do. I really assessed what it was that I enjoyed about the jobs that I've had, because I had I was very fortunate to have a really good career like what I had experienced. And I thought it was never the content. Okay. What I enjoyed was actually working within teams, working with people, training young people to make them effective in a very quick period of time, because towards the end, my job really was working on complex issues with multifunctional teams, making sure that everybody could do their role and perform quickly at a high level. So I wasn't trained in that space, but that's what I really wanted to do. So in that year I took off, I decided that's what I want to do. I want to get into a training and development role. So with my background, I started knocking on the doors of some of the big fours and said, look, this is my background, it's my CV. I'd like to do some training and development work. What can you offer me? And it was just so naive because they said, well, hang on, have you got a HR background? Have you got a training background? No, but I like it. I really enjoy it. So that didn't work. And by chance, I came in contact with an organisation called Leadership Management Australia. And they were looking for people to set up their own businesses in Australia. And what they were looking for was people with the management background that I had, but who weren't necessarily trained in the training and development field, which is what they did. They just needed people who were willing to build their own business in this space, and they would teach you about the training and development areas, and they could rely on your background to then connect with clients in that corporate, government, or military space, whatever I worked in, right? So that really appealed to me, and I ended up working with them. So when I came back after the 12 months period, I was actually offered 2 jobs. One was this quite interesting role in Canberra with the public service because of my background in a really interesting organisation, and I accepted that, but then decided not to go ahead with it because Leadership Management Australia offered me this role in Melbourne. So that was my entree into the training and development field. And what was so interesting about Leadership Management Australia was that they don't do traditional training. They have an emotional intelligence development focus. So they focus on EQ rather than IQ, which I was not familiar with. And they have quite an immersive way of training and developing people in that space. So I was just absolutely loving every minute of being exposed to that and really starting to understand what I sort of picked up along the way and may have been doing informally, okay? But this was now giving me all the structure around how you could do that. So that was a fantastic way for me to get into training and development. But the other opportunity it gave me an opportunity to start my own business because, as some of your podcasts have shown, many people would like to have their own businesses, but not everyone is willing to take the risk to do that. And for me, that was a challenge that I wanted to do. I've been working in all these large organizations, which was great. I had a great career there. But was I really good enough to start my own business? And to be honest, if I looked at those challenges, I would say starting my own business was probably the biggest challenge I had out of everything I've done. It is just so difficult to go from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you're sort of up in that high self-esteem area, and you basically go right back to the start of survival and, putting a roof over your head and putting food on the table, having to organise that first and then creating things to become successful in that space. But going into training and development gave me the opportunity to do both, start my own business and then go into an area where I think I really wanted to be. But having said that, I don't think I could have done that job or what I'm doing at the moment unless I had done all that other work in the military, in the public service and in the corporate sector. If I hadn't done that, I don't think I could have done this job as well as I think I can do it now.
I was going to say, when you think about your background, obviously I've worked in corporate and things like that, but I think there's a tendency for people to, if you work in a public service job when you get out of school or for your first job, you kind of continue, generally speaking, in public service. If you're working in corporate, you generally work in a big corporate. Many people stay in big businesses for a long time. A lot of people like small businesses, maybe move between the two, but people tend to stay in their lane, whereas you've jumped from lane to lane very quickly, and gone from sort of extreme in the business world, extreme experiences really. I mean, from military to government or public service to big business type stuff in Brussels with all these different structures and weaknesses and pluses. I mean, but I think your personality type is the same as mine. My brain's going mad thinking about all the different things that you would be absorbing. It must have been all of those different things that were going in that made you think, hang on, there are things I can do better here. That must have been why you ended up where you are, surely.
Yeah, well, I don't know what it was, Dave, because as an analytical, I thought I'd be planning my career a lot better. But I have to say, I never I probably had a plan, but it just never it sort of never ended up in that way, and I kept on being made these really interesting offers, which I decided, that sounds good. Now let's try that. So I ended up going down a pathway that I had not envisaged whatsoever. And then I ended up making a decision, which as an analytical you would never make, which is leave all this security behind and go down this really risky pathway and start your own business in a field that you know nothing about. And from what I can get from the podcast, actually, there's quite a few in BWM who've made those decisions and gone down that path, which is absolutely fascinating, right? And I think, and we'll probably get onto this, but I think that's part of the reason why BWM's got such a strong culture and a really interesting culture and an unusual culture in terms of with all the organisations that I've worked with over time.
So tell me a little bit about that, Richard. So how many organisations have you worked with over time as a trainer?
So if I follow my database, I would say I've worked with well over 200 different organisations, and they work across all industry sectors, and they're all of all sizes. So I've worked with the big banks. I've worked with federal and state government bodies. In fact, they were the training and development company areas that I focused on initially. So I was comfortable in those areas. So they're the ones I approached. They're the ones who gave me my initial work because of my background. And I learned a lot about training and developing people in an area where I was probably quite comfortable. Then over time, I started moving more and more into SMEs. And that's when I actually uncovered that SMEs suffer from these common areas. And a lot of it was probably because they're not as structured or as disciplined or as consistent as the larger organisations are. Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing, but that was just a difference that I had noticed. And then I started moving away from corporate and government. I started working with SMEs. And within the SMEs, I then started working into smaller and smaller companies or startup organisations who had high aspirations and high ambitions, and working with them. The one of the problems that you have is when you work with large organisations, you train and develop people, but you can never see an outcome because the organisation is so big and it doesn't necessarily make an impact on the organisation as a whole. When you work with smaller organisations, you can actually make a major impact on how they operate and do things. And out of SMEs, the ones that have the biggest change are the smaller organisations or startups. And they probably have the least structure and have probably got the least consistency in place. So it made sense to me to start thinking, okay, well, we don't want them to introduce all the structure that a large organisation has, but some of it is really quite good. So the areas that I uncovered were the ones smaller organisations could benefit from most was they should learn how to plan better and, most importantly, learn how to execute plans. They have to make sure that their workforce is highly engaged, is buying in and wants to take ownership. And a lot of that then evolves around engaging better and communicating better with the people that you're working with. And the third thing is making people the best they can be in their roles. And that's the training and development side of things. And larger organisations probably have a better system around it. They're not necessarily better at it, but they have a better process around it to do those things better than smaller organisations have. And that's probably why I became very interested, particularly over the last 10 to 12 years, to work with smaller organisations, because whatever I introduced, I could see changes very, very quickly, right? You start working in a small organisation, you get them to plan better and teach them how to execute plans. They actually do it if they are committed, and you can see the changes happening very, very quickly.
We've seen that actually with your work with some of our members. I'm thinking of one in particular who spoke to me recently about the difference he saw. And he was running, when you started working with him, he was running probably one of the busiest businesses we have. I'm not sure on numbers, but just doing a monumental amount of shoots a month. But his quality of life was really suffering because he's a perfectionist and was very kind of focused on every little thing. He was going to bed very late. He wasn't seeing his partner. He was on a path to burning out, basically. And he sat down with you and you gave him that structure. He had a very creative background as a graphic designer as well, and you gave him that structure. And he told me recently that it's just completely changed his life. He's about to go on holiday to Europe for 2 months. His business continues to grow and thrive. And I think that giving a creative person who's high functioning that level of structure and drive is hugely valuable. And it's really hard to just do by yourself when you're so busy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's not abnormal, right? So I think that the sort of things I've been doing with BWRM, helping Guy with the induction of new members and then directing him to the new member workshops, which Dave then runs and some of the directors participate in as well. That's a really good way to help people. But there is structure behind that. Working with some of the members and working with the directors of BWRM around creating plans, following the vision to work plan approach. That's essentially a refinement of what companies do. I just think it's a better way of doing it with smaller organizations. Get them to really think about what is it that you want your business to look like? What's important for you? What do you want to focus on? And if you've got other people in your team, do they understand that? Are they buying into that? And are they then able to contribute to that? And if they can't, train them up, spend time developing them. But most importantly, keep talking to them. Okay. So that's a thing that's easily done. It just requires some discipline to keep on doing it over and over again. And that's why I think the new member workshops that BWM has introduced is just so useful for the new members to follow that process and get exposed to new ideas that's really new for them. But BWM has already worked it out and said, look, it's your choice ultimately, but if you go down this pathway, you will actually get to where you want to go quicker, better, and you will actually get there. It's a great outcome. So they're the sorts of things that I think that I can introduce with my background into BWM, and I think it's worked pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. You spoke a little bit about the culture, and I'm very interested because I don't have a corporate background, really. I haven't had that much exposure to various cultures. And you've worked with so many different businesses and big businesses and small businesses. And in my mind, a big business just runs like a well-oiled machine and everyone's doing their job. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Dave's pulling his face and shaking his head. What is your assessment of the BWRM culture that you said you think sets it apart?
What sets it apart is this, right? So I mentioned that the best place I've ever worked was the Australian Telecommunications Authority, Austel, and that was all about culture. I just loved the culture, and that was really, really powerful and strong. I have never found that in any other of the larger organizations I've worked with. That was it. That was the best. And I'm very fortunate to be exposed to it. And the reason I say that is because if I were to look at all the companies I've been in, the prevailing culture for many organizations is negative. It is not good. And in some places it's particularly toxic, and I actually refuse to go in there because it's too hard to change that. What I think is really nice about BWRM is, and I've been to 2 conferences now and I've met most of the people, there is this similar feel that I had when I worked at Austel. People who come in are new to the process, but they are usually committed and want to do well. And BWRM has provided the platform for them to be able to achieve the goals and help them with the choices that they're going to make to create more success in their life. Okay? That's a fabulous way of introducing people to a culture. But generally speaking, there's a lot of support and collaboration, not just from the directors towards the members, just the members themselves really want to help each other out. And that is really unusual. And I think that is a great strength for BWRM. Now, as good as that is, it may still not be a fit for everyone. But for people who've got the right fit, you will keep on building this culture. And I think that is where the strength comes from. Within the BWRM group, it'll be an amazing organization if you can keep on bringing the right people in who join BWRM because they fit, not necessarily because they're great photographers or they're great business builders. They just have this fit that suits the culture for BWRM really well. And they will keep on contributing to this, what I think is a really, really amazing organization. And like I said, I work with a lot of them, and I think BWM is right amongst the top. And when I do this type of work, by the way, I should just point out there's only about half a dozen companies I work with, and it's the cultural aspect that I think is most similar. But I think BWRM is right at the top end of that smaller group of companies. The culture is great, and I have no doubt that that will continue as you grow.
Thank you.
One of the things I really like about the way the business is set up is, from our customers' point of view, they're dealing with a small business, and you've got the small business culture where you've got great customer service and attention, and you can get to the business owner very quickly, and quick responses. From our members' point of view, we're acting as a big business in that we can get a lot of work done, and there are processes and structures in place. And you've been a big part of setting those structures in place as well. Would you agree that that's the sort of strength of the way we've set things up from our customers' point of view?
Yeah, I think so, because if you look at businesses, particularly SMEs, they probably like dealing with the owners of the business that they're going to work with, right? And that's a good thing about BWM. You can say, well, I'm it. You're talking to the man or the woman who is actually going to make all the decisions and choices to make sure that you get the best service that we can offer. That's pretty powerful, I think. The other thing is that the people that you have and that I've met are actually great people. They're interesting, they're committed, and that comes out in the way that they speak. And we can actually work with them to become even better at that, so that they become even more attractive to potential customers and that sort of thing, But I think that the way that BWRM has set up everything is the ideal way of setting up a real estate photography business. And I think even within Leadership Management Australia, which is a licensing organisation, so it's not quite like a franchise because they can't control how we set up our businesses, but we do have to use their processes and approaches. I think I've learned from that and also made suggestions around, if you do this, you're likely to get a better outcome than if you were to do this. Okay? So I think the way that it's going, it's actually quite remarkable with what BWM has put in place. I don't think there's any franchising organisation that helps induct people into the organisation to the extent BWM does. And I'm working for one, LMA, who is really good at that, because that is what they teach other organisations as well, right? So BWM does it really well. They stay with them, and they've built this amazing culture, which is all about supporting each other. And I think that's rare. That is really unusual. So, yeah, look, I love working with BWRM just as much as I like working with the other organisations I'm working with, the smaller group. But there's something about BWRM around the cultural side that really interests me, and I would really like to learn more about how do you maintain that, how you make that stronger, because I think you set the foundations for that.
I think a big part of it comes from the fact that everybody's got the same goal, but the goal is still a personal goal. I think if you're working for a big company and you're just one of the cogs and you're going home with your salary, and, if you do a great job, you might get a pat on the back, but you don't have any ownership of the results, I suppose. Whereas with BWRM, and we've spoken about this in the past, when you win a client, that's your client. It is personal and it's your business, and it's a much bigger reward. It's a much bigger emotional high, all of those things. So I think when everyone's on the same path, you're much more committed to developing personally and developing your business, because it's your business. You're invested, versus if you were an employee. Even if you're an employee of a wonderful company that looks after you, you're still just an employee of that company.
Yeah, that's true.
Richard, it's been wonderful having you on here. We've obviously done lots of work together, but it's actually the first time I've really gotten to know your background, and it all just reiterates how lucky we are to have you with all your experience helping us and helping our members. So thank you so much for making the time to be here today.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed our chat, and I look forward to working with all of you in the coming days.
Thanks very much, Richard. Cheers.
Thank you.